Ready? We're streaming. I will call this meeting of the Legislative Audit Commission to order. It is June 28th, 2023. Good to see you, Auditor Randall. And we are going to be hearing today Southwest Light Rail Transit construction. Do we need a roll call just to confirm who's here?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Judy Randall, Legislative Auditor. It never hurts to have a roll call.
I think we'll do a roll call then.
Representative Hansen,
Present.
Representative Anderson,
Present.
Senator Barr,
Here.
Senator Dibble, Senator Drazkowski, Representative Greenman, Representative Jacob, Senator Karan,
Here.
Representative Lee, Representative Quam,
Present.
Senator Rest, Senator Zhang. That completes the roll. Five members are present.
Drazkowski's present.
And Jacob is present. I can see on the screen.
Roll has been corrected.
Thank you. And I anticipate members will be making their way here. So Ms. Randall, if you'd like to proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Again, for the record, my name is Judy Randall, Legislative Auditor. Pleased to be here today at the very end of the fiscal year. Congratulations on surviving session. We are here today, as you said, Mr. Chair, to release our evaluation report. It is our third report overall and our second evaluation report on the Southwest Light Rail Transit project. This one is related to construction and the Metropolitan Council's oversight of contractors. As you know, the legislature had directed us in 22 to do a special review, program evaluation, or both related to the Southwest Light Rail Transit project, and identified, I think, 15 to 17 different questions that the legislature wanted us to answer. And so this third report now goes deeper and focuses on yet more of those questions, in particular related to oversight of contractors during the construction process. Mr. Chair, with that, I'd really like just to turn to Mr. Kirchner, who is the evaluation manager for this project, to get into the details. Thank you.
Mr. Kirchner, welcome. If you could introduce yourself and.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is David Kirchner, and we have a little sound issue in the hall. Testing 1, 2, 3. I'm going to keep talking so that people can try and resolve the issue before I get started with my presentation. Testing 1, 2, 3. Okay, I think we are now settled. I think we have resolved the sound issue. Very good. Once for the record, now that we've gotten that sorted out, my name is David Kirchner. I'm with the Legislative Auditor's Office. I was the project manager for this evaluation, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that those online can see the presentation. And hopefully that has can I get the thumbs up from our folks? Is that all good? Great. I am going to be, I was the project manager for this evaluation, and I would like to, before I get started, thank the other members of the project team who worked very, very hard on this presentation. Caitlin Zanoni-Wells and Caitlin Schmaltz, who are sitting here behind me and are ready to help me out if I need them. I'm going to start off by presenting just our key findings. First of all, the Metropolitan Council's original civil construction contract did not provide sufficient mechanisms to enforce the contract's requirements. Secondly, the Metropolitan Council did not adequately enforce several aspects of its key construction contracts. And last, that the council does not have adequate documentation to support some of the project decisions it made on this project. So with that very quick overview, let me dive in just a little bit more. Our focus of our work in this particular project, as you know, this is the second of 2 program evaluations, was on circumstances where what happened was not quite the same as the original project specifications. And so we looked very specifically at two processes. The change order process, where there was a decision made to change what was being constructed. And this generally occurred before or during construction. And it authorized a change in the work from what was initially defined in the contract. And then the non-conformance process. And this would be when the contractor had built something that was not quite what was the original project specifications. And so there needed to be a process to examine that and figure out what should be done about that, whether or not that could remain in place or whether or not it needed to be repaired or replaced. And so we looked at those two processes. And that's what I'm going to go through in this presentation. I'm going to spend a bit more time on change orders, and then I'm going to move to non-conformance reports. So first, I want to talk about the change order process, but begin with a quick overview. Through October 2022, there were a little over 650 change orders processed and completed on this project. Most of those increased the cost for the project. And when you put them all together with the ones that increase cost and decrease cost, you end up with a total of $219 million of cost increase on the construction project. We, in our work, examined 16 of these change orders in depth. That is, we chose 16 for case studies, but we also looked at quite a lot of other change orders along the way on a less systematic basis and a bit more superficially. I want to briefly walk through the standard change order process. There are some alternative processes that I'm going to talk about in a minute, but this is on the screen. I have a very simplified version of what's on page 10 in the report, which is a more detailed flow chart. And basically the process is that either the contractor or the council would identify a change that might need to be made. The council would approve that that was a good change. And then there would be a process of defining what the scope of that change exactly was. And once that scope was defined, there would be two estimates that were made of the cost of that change. One estimate would be the contractor's estimate. That is, the contractor would propose, this is the price that we think that we should be paid for this change order. And then the council would produce a separate and independent cost estimate that was not the same as the contractor's estimate and would be developed independently. And in fact, the council hired a firm to produce most of these independent cost estimates. Once the council had the two estimates and was able to compare them, the council used that information to develop a negotiation position and enter negotiations with the contractor to determine what the final cost would be for the change order, what the final scope would be, and if there was any delay associated with the change, what that would look like. And then there would be the final approval of the change. And for changes that were at least $350,000, that approval would have to come not just from council staff, but from the Executive Change Control Board, which was an overview committee made up of Metropolitan Council members and Hennepin County commissioners. And if the change was at least $2.5 million, it had to go to the Metropolitan Council's governing body. And then at that point, the work would be carried out. However, the Metropolitan Council did not enforce all of the requirements of this process, and these involved requirements that had been in that original contract. The contractor was required to submit change proposals within 30 days of a council request, but they often did not meet that deadline. And in fact, for 30% of the change orders in that period up to October 2022, there were no contractor change proposals submitted at all to the council. The council did not penalize the contractor for not providing those change proposals. It complained and it told the contractor it had to put those in place, but it did not enforce the requirement that those change proposals had to be submitted. In part, this was due to the limitations of the original contract. The contract enabled the Metropolitan Council to withhold or deduct payments to enforce the provisions of the contract. However, that was kind of the key enforcement mechanism. The contract had kind of few other enforcement tools. And the council was reluctant to use this power, this withholding power that it had, in part because it didn't necessarily want to adopt a confrontational approach for things like, well, just, getting something in on time. But also because it did not feel that the contract language enabled it to withhold money for the contractor's failure to submit the documents that it was required to submit. The council also did not follow federal recommendations with regard to how the costs and delays would be resolved on these change orders. The council closed change orders often, or I should say the federal regulations recommend that all costs and delays be resolved. When you close out a change order, you should know what the cost is going to be, what any delay is going to be. But in fact, what the council did often was close out change orders with some of these potential delays unresolved. That is, the contractor would put a note into the file that said, we reserve the right to come back and claim that there is a delay associated with this change, and that we might be able to reopen this change in order to claim additional money as a result of that delay. Or even if they came back and didn't claim additional money, an additional delay would also lead to additional cost for the council, as we pointed out in our first report, that there's a very strong relationship between delays and increased costs. We also noted that when the council did need to go to these approval bodies, to the Executive Change Control Board and to the Metropolitan Council, we didn't see any record in the documentation that the council told those bodies that those changes that the bodies were being asked to approve as closed out could in fact later be reopened and additional claims sought against those change orders by the contractor. The council eventually kind of grouped all of this stuff together, the 30% of change proposals for which there had been, or excuse me, 30% change orders for which there had been no change proposal, and all of these outstanding possible delays. And they were resolved as a part of the 2022 settlement agreement. Now, as we note on the slide, the first couple of bullets, kind of the main reason for this settlement agreement was to reorganize the work in order to mitigate the delays that had occurred on the project. And the council agreed to pay up to $288 million to the contractor to resolve all of the additional work and the additional delays. However, as part of that settlement agreement, there was also a process by which all of those outstanding change orders and those outstanding possible delays were grouped together and resolved. There were a couple of large change orders that were still held out and negotiated separately, but basically they kind of created a new process to kind of deal with all the stuff that was still outstanding. The agreement also changed the dispute resolution process that had been in the original contract in order to assist the council to more timely resolve disputes between itself and the contractor and to reach resolution in a better fashion. I now want to talk about alternative change order processes. As I mentioned before, there were instances where the contractor went ahead and began work on a change before the negotiation had occurred as to what exactly that change was going to cost. This is a process that was allowed for in the contract, and it's something that is not unusual on construction contracts, but it did happen quite a lot on this project. At least 21% of all change orders involved the contractor beginning work before that cost had been negotiated. And at least that encompasses at least $50 million of that $210 million total I mentioned on the earlier slide. And we had a couple of concerns about how the council moved forward with these alternative change order processes. First of all, the Federal Transit Administration recommends that the project owner set an upper limit on what the cost is going to be. So even if you have not negotiated the actual change amount, you should at least set an upper limit and say, well, at least it's not going to be more than this amount. The council did not set those upper limits on the changes that went through this process, or at least it did not set limits that it then later enforced. Also, the process for dealing with these alternative change orders relies heavily on the contractor's reporting of its own costs, so that the contractor goes ahead and starts the work, but it keeps track of what it's spending. And then when you get to that negotiation process, the contractor can present, these are the costs that we incurred, and the council can check those. However, the council had difficulty sometimes verifying the contractor's costs, in part because of, we think, unclear requirements for what the contractor was supposed to submit and what the council was supposed to collect in between. And so it had difficulty matching things up. And in some cases, the council went ahead and just kind of accepted the contractor's reported costs without being able to actually do a full verification. So we have a number of recommendations in this first section of my presentation. First of all, the council needs to change its contract language to improve its enforcement tools and have more enforcement tools in the contract for future contracts that it might negotiate. Secondly, when it does have those tools, it should be enforcing the contractor's contractual obligations. You shouldn't have a contractor able to have 30% of its change proposals not being submitted. The council should be informing its approval bodies when changes include potential delays that are outstanding and might still produce an increased cost. The council should be limiting the number of changes where costs are not approved in advance. This is going to sometimes need to happen, but we thought that 21% was quite a lot. And it needs to correct its cost verification procedures so it can actually successfully verify when a contractor is presenting costs that it has incurred. I want to move on now to the second part of my presentation and talk about cost estimating. This is an important part of the process. When you have a change order, that's not something that's competitively bid. You can't get a whole bunch of different contractors to suggest what price they're going to set for the change orders, because it has to be done by the contractor that's already doing the work. And so that independent cost estimate is an important document that is used by the council in order to compare the contractor's proposed price to an independently set price and thereby obtain the best value for the use of public money. However, the council lost trust in its independent cost estimator consultant that it was retaining very early in the process. It found that the consultant had frequently failed to account for the complexities of this particular project. For example, it often felt that the consultant was not appropriately accounting for some of the difficulties of building right next to an active freight rail line, which is true for a large portion of this project. In order to account for these deficiencies, what the council did was direct the contractor to systematically across the board increase its cost estimates. And it did this for a majority of the cost estimates. And for 70% of these estimates that were created by its consultant, the council directed it to increase it in several ways. In the report, we have a kind of a side-by-side comparison. That's on page 27 of the report, where you can see the way in which the independent cost estimator originally did the estimate for one particular change, and then the way in which the systematic changes affected that. Those changes, I'm going to talk about three pieces of those changes. First of all, those systematic changes increase the amount of profit and overhead that would be credited to the contractor. Secondly, what they did was they added in across the board an increased amount for the use of disadvantaged business enterprise subcontractors. And it is not unusual to have what are called DBE firms to cost a little bit more. But what struck us was that they did this in every single instance, even when there was no DBE business that was working on these changes. And yet the cost amount that was being estimated was still increased. And also the council directed the cost estimating consultant to add in costs for unused equipment. So if, for example, the original specifications directed the contractor to do X, and then the change said, don't do X, do Y instead. But there had been equipment that was needed for X that was not needed for Y. Well, the cost estimator had said, well, we're not going to pay you for that equipment. But the council said, no, we should pay for half the cost of that equipment that was not used. And then the council took these second two things I talked about, the DBE costs and the unused equipment cost, and it rolled those into the base upon which that profit and overhead amount was calculated. So we had some concerns with this process, particularly because the council then used these adjusted independent cost estimates as the basis for developing its negotiation positions. Also, the negotiation positions themselves sometimes were significantly higher than the independent cost estimates. And sometimes we were able to see in the change order documentation why that was the case. You know, the scope had changed or something like that. In other cases, it was not clear to us at all why the council increased its negotiation position and by doing so got closer to the price that the contractor had requested. The Federal Transit Administration requires the council to determine, to have a finding essentially that it is paying a fair and reasonable amount. That's the language that's in federal regulations, a fair and reasonable amount for the change orders that it approves. We looked at how the council reached those conclusions, which it did in every case. It's an FTA requirement. And we found often that those fair and reasonable determinations were based upon the council's comparison between the contractor's proposal and those adjusted cost estimates, or on the negotiation positions that the council actually ended up using. In the end, the council paid the amount that the contractor had initially asked for about half of the time. I have here on the slide, and this is also reproduced in the report on page 28, I have a very low cost example just so I can kind of walk through what this process actually looked like. So this was for adjusting the drainage around a retaining wall. It's not a big change. It was less than $15,000, but we can use it to kind of look at the process here. So the original cost estimate by the council's consultant was about $5,300, and that was the cost estimate that they provided. The council applied its systematic changes to that estimate, and that increased the estimate by about 20% to about $6,200. The council then received the contractor's proposal, which was for a significantly higher amount, $14,200. And then the council looked at the adjusted cost estimate, looked at the cost proposal from the contractor, and came up with its negotiating position. And it did this partly by looking at some of the quantities that were involved and agreeing that the contractor was correct about some of the quantities that were different from the estimate. And it produced its negotiation position of $14,800. And then the council compared the contractor's proposal of $14,200 with that negotiation position and said, well, that's fair and reasonable. They're very close to one another, and concluded that that $14,200 would be the amount that it would pay for this particular change order. So as I said, we have some concerns about this whole cost estimating process. First of all, we don't really understand why the council continued to use cost estimates that it found to be deficient over and over again over a period of 3 years, and continued paying the cost estimator to provide cost estimates that it was disregarding or was changing substantially in order to make use of them. We think that the Metropolitan Council should have held the cost estimating consultant accountable for delivering acceptable estimates. And if it couldn't do that, then it should have voided the contract and rebid the contract and gotten a new cost estimator. We also think that this whole process of systematically increasing the cost estimates was not the way to go about doing this. And we had concerns about the whole process of making these fair and reasonable determinations. And just overall, we believe the Metropolitan Council should reform its processes for determining and justifying final change order costs. I want to move now and talk briefly about non-conformance reports. Very quick overview. There were about 700 nonconformance reports that had been closed out and concluded through November 2022 on this project. A little over half of them involved some sort of repair, rework, or replacing. A little under half involved the council deciding eventually to just kind of keep that work in place. That is, that they determined that the work that had been done was safe, it was going to meet the requirements of the project and could be kept, even though it wasn't exactly fitting to the original specifications. As with the change orders, we chose 16 of these to look at in depth and read everything that we could get our hands on about those particular nonconformances. But we also reviewed quite a few other nonconformances on a less systematic basis and somewhat more superficially. I want to walk through very quickly the nonconformance process. We have a more detailed chart on page 38 of the report, but basically it involves the council determining that the work that has been built didn't meet specifications. That could be done through an inspection, or sometimes the contractor itself came forward and said something went wrong here and we need to repair it. The council would go to the contractor and say, this doesn't meet the project specifications. What is your proposal? What to do something about this? And the contractor would make a proposal, either that the work be kept in place or that it be repaired or perhaps replaced. The council would then go to, the design engineer, and that is the designer that had originally made a recommendation, originally designed this project element, and asked the design engineer for a recommendation about what should be done, whether or not the design engineer agreed with the contractor's proposal. And then taking all of that information, the council would reach a final decision about what to do. Our overall concerns with regard to the nonconformance process primarily have to do with our concerns about documentation. We looked at a lot of these files, and as I said, at 16 in very great detail, and we found it very difficult to determine from the council's files how and why decisions were reached, what costs were incurred, and who was responsible for paying costs in some circumstances. We had particular concerns about the process of the council deducting money from the contractor. So there might be instances where, because the contractor didn't build something according to specifications, the council would be seeking a reduction in payment. And there might be two ways of this. One might be because the nonconformance caused the council to incur expenses. Another reason might be because the contractor was supposed to build under the contract specifications X. It actually ended up building Y, and the council might say, well, okay, Y is all right. We can leave that in place. But since Y cost less than X to build, the contractor shouldn't get to keep the difference between those amounts. The council should be recovering that. But the council has not actually carried out any of those deductions. It hasn't negotiated any of those deductions yet. It has decided to put all of that off until the end of the construction process, when it closes out the various segments of the construction. And that might be an okay approach, but we think that if that is the case, the council needs to have really good documentation, because it's going to be coming back to these decisions 2 years later and maybe as much as 3 years later, and then negotiating with the contractor about what the deduction would be. And we were not persuaded that the documentation in the files was adequate to do that, and the council would be prepared to do that. I want to talk about one particular example, which we point to in the report, and we have a detailed overview of this on page 43 of the report. And this is the Curry Maintenance Facility in Minneapolis. So this is a building owned by the city of Minneapolis. They use it to service and repair city-owned vehicles. And when the contractor was digging next to this building, at the time that the contractor was digging there, that building settled and there was damage to the building. There were some joints that came apart. A portion of the roof became detached from a portion of the outside wall. And we have here on the slide a picture taken from the point of view of the excavation with some workers looking into that area below the building where that settlement occurred. So the council hired, immediately stopped work, and it hired consultants to assess the damage to the building. And it agreed that the council was responsible for the damage that happened to the building and told the city of Minneapolis that it would make it right. It later hired a construction firm to make repairs to the building. However, the council and the contractor have never yet agreed on exactly what the cause of this damage was, or whether the contractor's actions were the cause of the damage that happened to that building. And all of that has been put off until a later point in time. The council has said it will come back and negotiate with the contractor and negotiate a deduction in the amount the council pays the contractor to pay for the costs that the council incurred. However, when we looked at the file, we were not persuaded that the council is really ready to make an effective negotiation. The council, there's nothing in the file that suggests that the council has analyzed the cause of the building settlement, analyzed whether or not the contractor's activities directly contributed to the settlement of the building, nor did we see any kind of listing or tracking of the costs that the council incurred, the costs the council incurred for hiring those engineering firms to assess the damage to the building, the cost the council incurred to repair the building, the cost that the council incurred because it changed some of its construction practices afterwards in order to make sure there was not additional damage to the building. None of that was in the file, although we did get some of that information from other sources. And so we can't assess whether or not the council has done a good job negotiating a deduction here, because that negotiation hasn't happened. But we are concerned that the council is not as prepared as it should be to enter that negotiation and to do the best job it can of protecting the public interest and the public dollars. And so our overall recommendation related to nonconformance is really that the council needs to improve its documentation of costs, of who's responsible for repairs, and very specifically, when you have these instances where there is a deduction, that's an area where we would like to see a lot clearer documentation and the council being more ready for those negotiations. And so I'm going to wrap up here with kind of an overall conclusion. I'm going to go back to where I started with our key findings. The council, Metropolitan Council, really overall, it needs to improve its contract language so that it is better able to enforce its contracts. It has more enforcement provisions in there. It needs to improve its enforcement. Once the contract is underway and the construction is being built, it should be holding the contractor to account, and it should be holding its cost estimation consultant to account as well. And the council needs to improve its documentation practices. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'm done with my presentation, and I would be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Kirshner. And I think we'll likely have a wide variety of questions for you, and then we'll bring Mr. Zelli up for their response and additional questions. And so with that, members will open up for questions. Representative Kwan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And looking at the example of a change order and ICE on slide 19, is this representative of the ones that you reviewed? What you said, it was like 16?
We thought it was a good example, and so we thought it was kind of clear and something that we could present. It would be hard to say that everyone was exactly the same, because there were differences in terms of how the systematic adjustments were applied from one to the other. It is true that there were systematic adjustments in 70%, but it wasn't always the case that it was a 20% difference. Sometimes it was less, sometimes it was more, so it is. And it is not always the case that the negotiation position was that much higher than the adjusted cost estimate. Sometimes the adjusted cost estimate and the negotiation position were very, very close. Sometimes they were further apart. Sometimes there were scope changes that happened later, that happened after that original independent cost estimate. Sometimes there weren't. So you have the type of variation that you might expect on a large construction project where there's a lot of differences from one to the other. But we thought that this illustrated the story that we were telling in a reasonable fashion, given the stuff we saw.
Representative Kwan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And what time frame was this in comparison to the others? Was it early on Was it sort of in the middle or later in what you looked at?
Mr. Kirschner.
I'm sorry, I don't have that information exactly when this particular change was done. I can get that for you, but I'm sorry, I don't have that with me today.
Representative Quam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The reason why I'm curious on this is because I'd like to see if there was a trend after the contractors discovered that there was a lot more fluff, buffer, additional stuff added in. Did they start increasing what their negotiating point was? That would be very good to understand. Was it before or after they changed the person, the contractor that was looking at this? And then looking at exhibit 3.1 and page 26 and some of the others in and around that area. And on page 27, 3.2, it appears as if the process, at least during the ones noted, didn't really care about the specifics. In other words, if there was what type of contractor it was, were there a need for additional equipment to be on hand, those type of factors. It just seemed as if they thought of everything that could possibly add to a cost, and then they threw more on than even that. And so trying to understand if this was consistent, if there was a change when they changed the contractor, if there was a change when the people doing the work discovered that they could get 30, 50% more for a change order than they were, needing. I guess that's the kind of background that would help us understand the evolution of the cost overruns. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Kirchner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We looked at all of the cost orders, at least in terms of the numbers. And I don't believe that, you're gonna tell me something? Yeah. So my colleague is pointing out to me that it is worth noting that the independent cost estimates are not visible to the contractor at the point that they make their change proposal. Now, they may, have spotted, a trend that they're often low, but at least it's important to note that the contractor does not get to see that independent cost estimate before it makes its change proposal. But I will say, I don't believe we saw, we didn't notice at least a trend. We can certainly go back and look, but I don't believe that we noticed any sort of a trend of the cost, the contractor's change proposals becoming higher and higher in relation to those cost estimates over time. I don't think we saw anything like, no, my colleagues are confirming that we didn't see that.
Representative Quam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You said that they hadn't seen the ice before they did. Did they get to see that kind of information after the negotiations? In other words, if they got to see or understand what the Met Council was utilizing, and they understood, well, we're not adding in as much buffer or profit or whatever factor, they would then, an intelligent person might say, well, we were too conservative. We've got wiggle room and get additional. If they also noticed that every time they came in with, well, not every time, there were a few examples here, a small percentage, but the vast majority of the time, there was no pushback. And if there's no pushback, every parent knows the boundaries are extended farther until they discover pushback. So I'm trying, that behavior would help me understand what kind of push we might want to have in the future to protect the, it's not just the taxpayers, it's if we don't waste money or have fraud or overruns, then we've got extra money that we can address all the things on our list Chair Hornstein has seen a huge list of infrastructure proposals that are needed across the state. So if we don't spend an additional hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars here, whether it's in the Met Council, regional spending, et cetera, a lot of these projects could go forward. So anytime offline that you can give us additional detail and insight would be wonderful. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Kirchner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for these questions, Representative Quam. A couple things to note. I think in fairness to the council, I don't think it's fair to say that there was never pushback. There were certainly instances in some of the case studies that we looked at where the contractor requested, a substantial sum of money, and the council said that's not we're not going to do that, and negotiated to a lower amount. That certainly did happen. It didn't happen in all cases, and we had concerns about the cases that we saw where it didn't happen, but it did happen in some cases, and it wouldn't be fair to suggest that it never happened. The other thing I will note, you're asking about kind of how the contractor might have adjusted its activities, and I will say that the council has characterized the contractor as being pretty aggressive and intelligent negotiators in general. And so if they found ways in which they could improve their negotiating position based upon the council's description of that firm, I would have expected them to try and find those.
Mr. Chair.
Ms. Randall.
Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And if I could just add also to respond to Representative Quam's comments, I think it gets to the broader question about enforcement of the contract writ large, right? And without more robust tools that the council had available to them, they were very reluctant to use the tools they had, right? I mean, the tools they had were, as Mr. Kirchner said, withholding money or deducting funds, and they were very reluctant to do so in fear of potential litigation or the contractor walking away. And so when you have that kind of imbalance, it wasn't really a true partnership, it didn't seem to me, with the council, again, not being willing to enforce using the tools it had. It then led to, I think, problems throughout in terms of oversight and holding the contractor accountable.
So we're going to go to Senator Dibble and then Representative Hornstein and then Senator Drazkowski. Senator Dibble.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think Senator Quam kind of started pulling on the string that I was going to start pulling on a little bit. I'll just start with an opening comments, which is, we've been asking now for quite a while, how could it be that this project has been delayed this much and have a cost overrun on the order of 3 times the original estimate? And the answer we've been getting back from the Met Council has been, we're completely powerless. We've been subject to forces beyond our control and we're totally unanticipated. To the first argument, I think Representative Hornstein and I have made the point repeatedly that much of what they encountered, which drove cost and delay, tunnels, additional station stops, should have been anticipated because they were told many, many, many times. So there's something really terrible in the ability of this agency to receive good information from external to the organization, and is impervious to critique and criticism and good ideas. So the project from its conception had real problems. And then we get into the project management, project construction phase. And in the previous reports and now this report, which I think lays it out in stark black and white detail, the point that Representative Quam was hitting on, which is probably the most salient, which is this retaining wall. With some professional civil engineers saying, maybe we should increase the payment costs, by about, we should pay a total of $5,000. Okay, $6,000 and we end up paying 270% more, almost 3 times more than what we should be paying. The fact that change orders are pegged as, being held open for future cost and delay implications that then get reimbursed for. The fact that $300 million was paid just to sweep a whole bunch of problems under the rug and not deal with them individually. The matter of this curry wall, and I underlined one of the arguments that to this day, the contractor continues to argue that not only is it not responsible for the damages to the building, but should be paid for its time and effort with an agency that doesn't even bother to fully document the circumstances. The fact that now we're looking at probably another huge payout at the end for construed costs and overhead. The fact that built in paying for equipment costs and overhead and management practices that don't even exist. So my question, which you probably can't answer and you'll probably take a pass on, is there any indication that laws have been broken here? Are we in violation of either procurement laws or even public management of public funds or even criminal laws?
Mr. Kirchner or Ms. Randall?
Thank you for the question, Senator Dibble. I think I'll start on that question by saying that when we look at the federal requirements for change order processing, what we find is that they're pretty vague. In other words, you're required to have this fair and reasonable determination. But exactly what that constitutes is left a little bit up to the eye of the beholder. And so they are required to do a cost analysis. They are required to make the determination that the amount that they're paying is fair and reasonable. And the council did those things. Now, we have questions about how fair and reasonable those actually were, but the council did meet the letter of what the law says, because the law, a number of the things we noted in passing, I don't know if you noticed, but we refer to them as recommendations by the Federal Transit Administration. There are things that are in Federal Transit Administration regulations which are not binding. And so we point out where the council is not following those, but that's not illegal, because those are either in guidance or they are in some form of recommendation. So I'll start there. And I do want to say one other thing in passing, just because you mentioned it, with relation to the Curry building, and it goes back to Representative Quam's question. So that request by the council, by the contractor to be paid additional for its Curry building work, that was a change order that the council did reject. So that's an instance where the council did push back at what the contractor recommended and said, no, we are not going to pay you for the work that the additional work on this, because that's something that's related to something you did. As I said, that doesn't mean that we don't have lots of other findings about lots of other things we do have questions about, but it is, in fairness to the council, there were instances where we saw things where we thought, they made the right call.
Ms. Randall, you want to weigh in on any laws broken here?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Senator Dibble. We do not state in the report that laws were broken, so I will acknowledge that. Certainly, there were instances, as Mr. Kirchner said, where best practices weren't followed, recommendations weren't followed, but as he also said, that's not breaking the law. And I will mostly take a pass, but I will also say that we are currently conducting a financial audit of some of the transactions related to this project, where we are digging even deeper. So I don't know yet what we are going to find. That's not, a veiled implication of anything, but there may be more information.
Senator Dibble.
Just a couple of more quick points that may result in questions. We'll see. So, on the matter, I'll just make the point on the matter of the fact that, a large number of these change orders were started with no agreement that they should commence and or how much they will be priced or what their implications were for, the critical deadlines, et cetera. The fact that decision makers were simply not informed that there may be inadequate information to approve decisions, that there were there was some insistence on the part of the contractor to keep them open despite FTA clear direction that these matters be closed before they're paid off and they proceed, is pretty jaw-dropping. This is the question that results from that line. And then I have one more question. How much of the responsibility would lie with those decision-making bodies, whether it's the decision-making body that approves the kind of the lesser change orders and or the Met Council? How much should we be looking at? These are in many instances, high-ranking officials, appointed officials, those with whom the proverbial buck stops. They're making decisions. They're clearly making decisions in the dark. They have the wool pulled over their eyes. The agency, the bureaucrats aren't bringing everything to the table, but ultimately they're responsible. And should they be probing? Should they have been probing further to say, is everything in order for us to make this decision fully informed and in good faith?
Ms. Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Senator Dibble. Short answer, I think yes. A board, a council that's overseeing and approving has a responsibility to understand what they are approving. We have had numerous conversations, both this legislature and legislatures over the past decade plus, about the accountability associated with the Metropolitan Council and the council members. As we all know, right now they are appointed by the governor, but they are responsible. And I believe they should behave as if they were held accountable to electors or to whomever, regardless of how they are in that seat. So, maybe in the beginning, I think you trust the professionals who are working in this area. I mean, you have to, right? You all have to trust the professionals who come to you from all the different agencies. That's a reasonable approach. But I think as this project, excuse the pun, started to go off the rails, and there are more and more questions, I would expect an oversight body to themselves start to ask more and more questions and get more and more into the details. So I do think that there is an important role there that we didn't see them being engaged. Now, if they're not told information, okay, but were they asking for that information? And if they're not informed enough to ask those questions, then I think they need to explore how to get informed, right? Do you form a subcommittee of the council that can really dig in and bring staff on that are experts to help guide them? I think there's more kind of structurally from a governance and accountability structure and process that could have happened. Would that have stopped all the problems? No, but it might have at least helped to have more transparency around them.
Senator Dibble.
Thanks. I'll try to be quick on these. I have two more questions very quickly. One is, what got our attention initially to this whole subject was the issue of the independent cost estimates being completely disregarded. The independent cost estimator looking to protect its professional reputation and its legal exposure through some fairly unique means, by putting disclaimers on the documents that were going forward. Additionally, kind of getting into the non-conformance piece, saying, oh, by the way, you need more expertise on hand. You've got contractors who are known to behave in certain ways, building things on the cheap, trying to wildly exaggerate its costs, real quality control issues, management and oversight, and the Met Council looking to force the independent cost estimator to drive its estimates up to get closer to what the contractor was demanding. Now we see that in fact happened. Mr. Kirshner, you said that the Met Council lost confidence in the independent cost estimator because it wasn't, I assume because it wasn't doing these things that it was being demanded. Did the Met Council provide any rationale, any objective justification for trying to move closer, trying to force the independent cost estimator to move closer to these prices, as well as accepting some of the delays that the contractor was demanding?
Kirchner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that's probably a question best directed to the council. I will say that our understanding is, as I noted in the presentation, that the council often felt that one of the problems, at least that the council had, was that it often felt that the cost estimator was not appropriately accounting for the complexities of this project, and that those complexities made it more expensive for the contractor to do some of the work. And as one example is, as you're aware, this project is being built right next to an active rail line. And so when you're building right next to an active rail line with freight trains going through on a regular basis, that means not only do you have to stop work every time a freight train goes by and make sure everyone is safe, but it also means that the ways in which you position equipment, the ways in which you bring materials onto the site, the ways in which you store stuff, the ways in which you organize your entire work are very different than the ways in which you would do that if you were working in an open space with acres and acres of space on either side of the track. And the council felt that the estimator was not sufficiently accounting for complexities like this. But I really feel like that's as I said, a question probably more fully can be answered by the council. And certainly the cost estimator had a very different point of view. As you said, the cost estimator felt very strongly that its estimates were appropriate and were in fact taking into account all necessary complexities on this project. So that there's clearly a difference of opinion between the two sides. We laid that out in somewhat extensive detail in a memo that our office released 2 years ago, back in October 2021. And the point of view that we're taking here is not necessarily who's right or who's wrong in that dispute, but we're looking at this simply from a contract management standpoint and saying, you are the owner of this project. You're the person running you get to make the decisions. You know, you're the client, and the client is right. And if you're not happy with the information that you're getting from somebody you've hired and you're paying money to give you information, then you ought to be doing something to get something that is more appropriate for what you want. And that is true whether or not you're hiring someone to do cost estimates, whether you're hiring somebody to dig a tunnel, whether you're hiring somebody to do anything. If you're not getting what you think you ought to be getting, then you ought to be taking action to enforce the contract. And it may be that the independent cost estimator is right in its claims that its estimates were better than the council's, but in the end, it's the council that is the client that ought to make a decision. And we don't understand the process of continuing to pay the cost estimator for estimates that the council didn't believe in. If you don't believe in the estimates, you shouldn't pay for them.
Final question, Senator W.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I like that final point. If the cost estimator, there's a whole subject of, if the cost estimator is doing such a terrible job, why not just throw them out the door and or enforce the contract differently? I have a parenthetical to that, but I'll bring it up when the Met Council comes up. Finally, on this subject of nonconformity. So when items are built either not to standard or of lower quality or incorrectly, the council has taken note of that and asked for something to be redone and or said, we're not going to pay you the full price for something that you built on the cheap. or isn't up to the quality standards that we expect. However, has failed to fully and adequately document, as you've cited in the report, and has decided to push the reconciliation of all of those matters off into some indeterminate point in the future when this project may or may not be finished. Who knows if it's ever going to get done at this point. Given that lack of good data, adequate documentation, and I'm aware that in some instances, some of the demands that work be redone has resulted in the contractor trying to construe that as a change order to be paid for their time and trouble, similar to the Curry building experience. Is the Met Council, clearly it will be disadvantaged in the negotiation because it won't be able to bring good arguments to the negotiating table at the end to negotiate what sounds like it's going to be a big package lump sum, similar to the effort to sweep all the change order issues under the rug, a year or so ago. So clearly it'll be disadvantaged in the negotiation. Will it have legal exposure though? If it demands a certain price for the reconciliation of all of these matters altogether without the ability to justify that price?
Mr. Kirchner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think there is always the possibility that things could go to a legal venue in any sort of large contractual relationship between a government entity and a contractor. One of the things that the council did to limit that possibility was to put into place through the settlement agreement these alternative dispute resolution processes that had not been in place in the original contract. And in fact, I believe the council has said that they intend to put these into future light rail contracts as well. And that should limit the extent to which anything would go to litigation, because there is a process laid out in the contract for disputes that involves a mediation process. And then if you can't get to an agreement, a binding arbitration process. And then that is, of course, still a legal process, but it is not quite the same thing as going to court. Because there is this process for resolving disputes laid out in the settlement agreement that will be true for all disputes on this contract going forward. Thanks.
Representative Hornstein.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks very much again to the auditors and the Audit Commission for holding this hearing and doing these reports. Just a couple of questions. One is, you had mentioned, Mr. Kirchner, the 21% change order rate and also 700 non-conformance reports. These numbers seem high to me, but I don't have a lot of context. So, how out of whack is this, compared to other large projects, like this one?
Mr. Kirchner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to clarify, the 21% is the percentage of change orders that were done using these alternative processes where the change was put into place prior to, or they started working on the change prior to negotiating the change order. With regard, we don't have good comparison numbers on that, but we did. The Metropolitan Council has said to us that they agree that rate was higher than they would like it to be, and that has been one of the challenges of managing this contract. They attribute it to the special circumstances that have surrounded this project and all the difficulties that they have had. From our point of view, we're looking at this kind of from a broader perspective of kind of protecting the public dollar. And every time that you take some of these exceptions, then you have less leverage in order to protect that public dollar. So when you start out at the beginning, we talked about this in the first report, you have you open the project up for bidding. And that allows you to get competitive bids, and that allows you to try and get the best fair value. But if you leave some things out of that bid and you move them off and you push them over to change orders, oh, we'll add this later as a change order. And they did that with some large pieces with the corridor barrier protection barrier and the Eden Prairie Town Center Station. Then you're taking large pieces and you're not getting competitive bids for that. So you're making an exception. And when you've made that exception, well, then you have less leverage to protect the public dollar. So those exceptions should be rare and they should be small under a best case scenario. And then this is yet another example. Oh, we're not going to negotiate the change order first. We're going to negotiate that. We're going to actually start the work first and negotiate it later. That's another exception you're making to your process. And so what you're doing is you're making exceptions to that process that's supposed to protect the public dollar. And those should be rare and they should be small. And so we're concerned when we see it's not rare and it's not small, in that it's at least 21% of all change orders. And we're talking about a total of $50 million. And so that's the kind of perspective we're looking at it from. We're not necessarily comparing to other projects. We're talking about why, you need to have exceptions sometimes, but those exceptions should be rare and they should be for particular reasons, and they shouldn't become the standard because that's where you get into trouble and you end up not getting the fair value that you should get. And you had a question about nonconformances, and I want to note that 700 nonconformances, that sounds like a large number, but that includes a lot of things, some of which are very, very minor. A nonconformance can be something as simple as there being rust on rails that need to be, not rails for the track, but like the railing at a station, after it's built and then 2 years later, some rust develops on it, you just take it out and you put new stuff in. It's a couple $1,000s. It's a small item. Or perhaps even less than that. So it's not that 700 is not a reflection of, kind of the amount of severity of the nonconformances. It's just a number. And the thing is that because of the way the council does this documentation, we can't really give you an overall dollar amount that goes with that 700. And that's partly because the way the council views this is that when a change needs to be made, that's the contractor's responsibility. And the council doesn't necessarily track what the contractor is spending because the council isn't eventually paying for it. And so there isn't an overall tracking of costs for these change orders. There was, as we point out in the report, there was an internal audit that was done that suggested the council should track the costs of repairing those change orders. So it has an understanding of that, but the council has not followed that internal audit recommendation.
Thanks. And just
Representative Hornstein.
Mr. Chair, just a couple more here then. So on the non-conformance reports, you had on page 11, slide 22, 48 in the category of other/missing. What are those? What would that be?
Mr. Kirchner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A large number of those in that category are some of the very first non-conformance reports while the council was still kind of getting its process in place. And so there was less documentation of those. And then we actually determined later by talking to the council that in some places they just put their documentation in different places that we didn't know to look. So we could actually, we found out after we got to that, done with that part of the report, we could have maybe moved a few of those into other places. But it was basically very early non-conformances. Most of those are very early non-conformances that were just, the documentation was done in a different way and was not in the same place as all the others. And so we just weren't able to count those without reading every one of them individually. And this, of course, is a chart of 700 things, and we didn't read every one of those individually. Yeah. We were relying on data.
Yeah. Good.
Representative
Okay.
Ornstein.
Thanks. And then just a couple of quick ones here. So, Chair Dibble and I represent, we have many constituents that live in the Cedar Isles condominiums. And of course, those are the condos that are right next to the pinch point there in the Kenilworth corridor. And, last year, there was a report from a consultant, Soco Tech, that was addressing some of the concerns of the residents around vibrations. Did you look specifically at that contract at all? And, if so, were there any conclusions you had with that?
Mr. Kirchner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We did look a little bit into the issues surrounding the Sika building, but that is something that is the subject of active litigation. And so that's something that we have really avoided commenting on for the most part. I don't know if Judy wants to add more. Okay.
Okay, thanks. And then the last one, Mr. Chair.
Representative Hornstein.
I think at the last audit commission, there was some reference to the Executive Change Control Board, which I think does oversee some of these change orders. Do you have any thoughts or comments on the role of that board? And did you examine that at all in the context of this report?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the question. We did look at the decisions made by the Executive Control Board, and as we noted in the report, we were concerned that there was some information that we're not clear was actually making it to the Executive Change Control Board. We don't go in detail in the report into the role of the Executive Change Control Board, but I think we talked about it in the first report that it's pretty much a body that kind of approves a decision kind of after it's already been made. It always has the ability, if it wants to say, actually, we're not going to approve this change and you need to go back to the drawing board and do something different. But that's not the role it has taken. It has pretty much approved what it has come to it for the most part.
Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Senator Drazkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Kirschner, Ms. Randall, for your presentation. This is very, very troubling, I think, for probably everybody on the commission to hear this as we attempt to digest this. It seems we've got an agency that is rogue. We've got a large piece of government that's operating rogue and apparently not even contemplating its fiduciary responsibilities to the taxpayers of the state of Minnesota. So very troubling. Thank you for bringing that to light. But the question, of course, that remains with all of us is why? And probably Mr. Kirschner with you too, I'm guessing. And as I think about that, there might be 2 or 3 explanations. We've got an agency that's inept. That could be one. There could be corruption, or it could be a combination of the two. Obviously people are going to say there's ineptitude here, and it appears there's a great deal of it. Did you ever suspect there was any corruption that may exist of any sort as you piled through these documents and interviewed people, and your mind asked the same question that mine just did?
Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It is absolutely a responsibility of this office to report on instances of corruption that we find. And had we seen anything like that, we would have put it in the report. We did not.
Senator Drazkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Kirschner. That answers a question for me. And I'm reading your recommendations, Mr. Kirschner, and the recommendations for the council. And I know some of these have been discussed in the past, and it seems that the council isn't following some of the recommendations of the past. We don't know if they will follow these. I haven't digested what their responses were yet, and we're going to hear from the Commissioner Zelli. But what recommendations would you have for us as a legislature, given what you have experienced and where we're at this point in time?
Mr. Kirchner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the question, Senator Drazkowski. This particular report focuses really on contract management processes, and we view those as being kind of within the purview of the agency. And so we do not have recommendations for the legislature in this report, but our recommendations from the first report, several of which were to the legislature, still stand. We certainly think that the legislature needs to be paying closer attention to what the Metropolitan Council is doing. We think the legislature, as we said in that first report, ought to create a framework in which the government entity that is building a light rail also bears some financial responsibility, so that if they have cost overruns, it hurts. And if they save money, then they have extra money that they can spend. We think that would be a better process. And we think that the legislature needs to inform the Metropolitan Council needs to inform the legislature. No, I'm rephrasing that. Thank you. Judy is pointing to the recommendation. The legislature should require the Metropolitan Council to inform the legislature when there are cost overruns. And there is already a legislation that is out there on for this particular project that has that requirement in there. But we think that law could be tightened. And we also think that it could apply to all light rail projects and not just to Southwest Light Rail. So those recommendations still stand.
Senator Drazkowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Kirschner. Those are excellent recommendations, and I thank you for those, and thank you again, Mr. Chair.
Senator Karan and then Representative Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and we appreciate your work, Mr. Kirschner. But when we get down to the bottom, I think what this whole process has highlighted is so many different levels of either lack of clarity, lack of understanding the process, or lack of desire to follow process. And the entire, you just mentioned it, right? The contract management process. There's a variety of components in there. One is the original procurement method chose to use it or chosen. And we know it can be restrictive. It's typically very ineffective in government. So I'll have that question for Mr. Zelli when he comes up to talk about that. But one of the key components is the contractor or even the consultants don't decide what the need is, the project scope and the detailed elements embedded within every one of them. So what we're seeing today is either a lack of understanding the decisioning of the changes, as I think Senator Dibble talked about, adding a rail, adding a stop and all those things, to understand those and then to accurately articulate those in writing so we can apply it as a service level agreement within a contract or desired outcome. And so we spent over 20 years planning for this process. And I believe there are likely hundreds of people who worked on this at the Met Council alone, not including the other independent contractors that were brought in or the contractors themselves actually do the work. And so when we look at the entire process, this is the culmination of, I believe, not knowing the needs in a manner so detailed, which is their job, by the way. These are complex. They weren't supposed to be multi-billion-dollar projects, but it is now. And it's a culmination of all those different levels. So you're just highlighting, right? Some of them look minuscule, $50 million here, still $50 million. What's the impact? We have a very detailed process, or should have a very detailed process to deal with every one of these. It's not the first major project, certainly has moved to be the most expensive. But with that, you guys are charged with looking at the policies, right? The law. Mr. Kirschner, when you requested, because I assume one of your original requirements is to get their policies around every element in which you're to measure against. When you asked for that documentation for overall contract management, which includes all the subsections of dispute resolution, service level agreements, conflict, all of those things, risk of projects started at, I call them at projects at risk in the contract, right? You started work without approval. Even a nod, right, in our world isn't approval. We have very defined, you in the private world can make a handshake and move on. Now, try to hold that up in court, but we don't have those options here. So when you requested those documents, what were you provided in every aspect? What was the procurement process used? What were the elements within that process to manage? They have an executive rate change order board, so they had some things in place, or were those just created out of this process? So if you could just give me a high level of what that looked like.
Mr. Kirchner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And we did ask for, and we did go through a large number of policies and procedures and processes that the Metropolitan Council has for these various processes, the change orders and so forth. And so we looked at all of those things. And when we present you with our little flow charts in the report, that reflects what the process is supposed to look like. And so we did get all of that stuff, and we did look at that from a process standpoint. But then what we also did was we looked at actual 16 case studies where we read everything. We read whatever we could get our hands on related to, okay, how was this decision actually made? Who made it? What was the basis upon this decision? What information did the Metropolitan Council gather in order to make this decision? What was documented in the file? What was not documented? What was in their construction management software system? And one of the things that we found is that sometimes we kind of had the beginning and we had the end, but we didn't have a lot of the stuff in the middle in terms of trying to figure out what was going on. That documentation was not always there. And so we then went back to the council and we said, there's more stuff here. Can you provide us with all of the documents that you have that involve how the decision was made and who made it and what the decisions were about cost. And we have a list of this of what we asked for in the report. I believe it's on page 45 of the report. And we asked, we were expecting to get, some additional documentation, maybe some emails that would provide information and so forth. And what the council provided us with a lot of information in response to that request. In fact, it provided us with, for the 16 individual cases that we looked at, it provided us with 6,000 unlabeled and unsorted email messages and attachments. And if our conclusion was, if that is how the council is documenting its decision-making process, then that's going to be extremely difficult for the council to use when it moves forward to these deduction negotiations that it's going to have. If that's how it needs to kind of figure out exactly how the decisions were made, is through going through piles and piles of emails like this to find the ones that are relevant. Because I will note that the vast majority of what they provided us was not actually relevant to the decisions that we were asking about. It was things like, the meeting has been moved to a different conference room, and 5 people responding saying, oh yes, I'll be there, and things like that. So to us, it reflected, you have a process that is laid out for what's supposed to happen. But then when we tried to look at what actually did happen and use the documentation the council was collecting in order to show what it had done and why it had done it, then we had some significant challenges.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Christian. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so you've defined, we do have process at least defined, and it was provided without resistance, it sounds like. In those 6,000 emails, 2 questions. Did you ever find the actual answer that will help us in the end negotiations for whatever the issues are? And then what was the percentage of unnecessary, irrelevant information that they included, which you labeled as or you identify as unlabeled, unidentified, and could it be construed as maybe haystacked, which would not be a cooperative agency action if they were interested in transparency?
Mr. Kirchner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will say that for some of the nonconformance reports that because this is specifically about the nonconformance reports. We also got a whole bunch of emails and attachments for the change orders as well. But for the nonconformance reports, which is what this listing is about, I would say it varied. In some cases, there were emails in there that gave us greater insight into how decisions have been made, most definitely. In other instances, we didn't learn everything that we wanted to learn, and that's partly why we came to the conclusions that we did. That sometimes the documentation just didn't seem to exist. Now, when we asked the questions, we often we could get oral answers from people who were involved with the process that said, well, yeah, I was there and we decided it based on X. But when you wait for 2 years or 3 years, you kind of hope that person is still there and has not moved on to another project or another employer altogether. And in terms, we did not quantify how many of the documents were relevant and how many were irrelevant. I'm gonna guess that it might have been less than 10% were relevant. And my colleagues shaking and saying, oh yeah, definitely less than 10%. So.
Thank you, Mr. Kirschner.
Senator Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so I appreciate your response. And so on the contracting side, we hired in a variety of government work you do. You have a higher independent validation, verification, quality assurance, procurement support. In this case, it sounds like we had the appropriate support to go through complex construction analysis. And I assume that firm has a variety of disciplines, certainly from what Senator Dibble said, and that he's a little bit more intimately involved in it than we were, but put a lot of warning signs in there to one, to protect themselves, but two, as an awareness, right? Here, hey, my job is to raise red flags, and then you guys are going to make decisions based on that. But help me, they were hired, you said early on in the process. That's what, 3.5 years ago, or now longer than that. But I think the Met Council's rebuttal is or your discovery is they disagreed early on. And we've seen kind of the disagreement bear out in a couple different forms, at least as the work you've done. But they kept them, my understanding, for over 3.5 years. In fact, I think their rebuttal or their disagreement with your assessment is that they just replaced them and sought additional or new resources to fulfill that need just this April. And so if that divide was so large, again, I think they had the responsibility to go in and ask those questions. And I guess I'll narrow my question down to just the one aspect, because I know there's so many areas here. On the DBE, the disadvantaged business enterprise, the independent contractor put the assessment not only in equipment that ultimately wasn't included, but they laid an assessment, and I believe that's what, an 8% cost assessment, and an additional 8% increase in assumed cost, increasing the cost across the board. And then is it my understanding too, even when because I believe there's multiple phases of this process. Upfront, they just applied it across the board to all things, whether it applied and there was a contractor hired that met that criteria. But across the board, even when it was known that a DBE contractor was not selected, no adjustment was made in the tail end. So we paid, or at least started our negotiating position in a much higher and much more inaccurate proposal or display of what the real facts are. And again, further disadvantaging the negotiating process. And I think the fiscal responsibility of our dollars for every one of these. So could you describe, did I leave anything out in what I read?
Mr. Kirchner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that's an excellent summary. I'm going to ask you to give our presentation next time around. I appreciate very much the care with which you characterized the increase, because it's important to distinguish that what we're talking about is an increase in an estimate. In other words, it's not the case that because the estimate was increased that therefore they paid more. I mean, it meant that, as you said, they went into the negotiation process with a higher starting amount as their kind of negotiating position than they might have otherwise. But we have no way of knowing what would have happened had they gone in with a lower figure and entered that negotiation, because it's a negotiating process, and we can't know what would have happened otherwise.
Senator Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Quick last. Who was the exact body that made the decision to override and open the negotiating position in a higher cost position, which is inaccurate reflection of the actual true cost as they estimated at the time? Who override that decision?
That is that decision was the responsibility of the project team. So I think I mean, you can ask Met Council directly, but I believe that would be a decision made by the project directors or by their subordinates.
Representative Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the legislative auditor. Most of my questions was for the Met Council, but I will try with the legislative auditor first, and then hopefully the Met Council could address them. So my main focus is on the Met Council losing trust in the independent cost estimators. And then when I look on page 24, I see a little box there. You said that one company, two roles, where the cost estimator was the designer, engineer, and also the primary cost estimator. And so, just listening to the discussion here around protecting the public dollars and, negotiating powers, can you let us know, did you look into the process or were there public biddings as to why ACOM became number one and number two for those two roles?
Mr. Kirchner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the question, Representative Lee. Our understanding is that having the design engineer also serve as the cost estimator, and I will note that these aren't necessarily always the same people, they just work for the same firm. Our understanding is that has been a fairly common practice with regard to light rail construction nationwide. That is what MnDOT found in a peer review that they did last year. And so the council was kind of following a well-trod path here in doing that. However, MnDOT pointed out that is something that they do not do. And that was a recommendation that MnDOT made in their peer review report. And I will note, by the way, that we do have a link to MnDOT's peer review report on our website for those that are interested. MnDOT recommended to the council they not do this in the future, that they separate those roles. And my understanding is that the Metropolitan Council has committed to separating those roles in the future so that the cost estimator will be independent from the design engineer, because the concern is that the cost estimator also being the design engineer, they have some sort of interest in perhaps protecting the design from changes in terms of possible conflict of interest.
Representative Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And then just mostly focusing on the findings that you have, then you said early on in the construction process, they found out that the Met Council lost trust in the estimating process. Can you identify when, in particular, timeline wise, was it 2019, 2020, when this came about? And then was there any reasoning when you reached out to the Met Council as to why they retained them up until, is it today, or when did they terminate this relationship?
Mr. Kirchner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the question, Representative Lee. I'm sorry, I've lost the first half of your question. I was focusing on the second half of it. The first half of the question was, well, when did they lose trust? Right. I was going to point the committee to, we released a memo about this that was sent to Representative Hornstein and Senator Dibble back in 2021 that details the back and forth of the negotiation or the correspondence between the two sides. But our sense was as early as 2020. They were having serious concerns about the cost estimates that they were receiving. So that's, within a year of the project starting. In terms of why they held on to them so long, I'm kind of, I'd be inclined to let Metropolitan Council answer that question. They do address it in their written response, and you can see what they have to say there.
Representative Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So, Mr. Kirchner and Ms. Randall, we've had several of these reports or reviews and discussions, and I think those have occurred in committees as well. And I'm trying to digest what this all means. I was thinking back just one of the earlier presentations where in terms of light rail construction, we are expensive and delayed. I seem to remember a bar graph comparing it to other states. And then I look at this situation and this details some of the challenges that are there. And it details, we have an independent cost estimator, we have a board to review things, we have an appointed board, we have staff, we have the authority question of who did what when, but we still have this massive problem. And it sounds like the problem is still there, that there are things that have been punted where there's not a decision that's been made in terms of cost that could end up costing a lot more. And then we have the ongoing, if this gets completed, the costs that are there. Now, it seems to me we can't manage by audit. I mean, it's not your job. And, you know, to the council, what's their job? So we have all these structures that are in place, but they all fail at some point. Everything's failed. So do we need something like a, when financial catastrophe occurs, sometimes you have something like a special master come in. Maybe it's a quasi judicial role that comes in and here's these cases are almost arbitration on these expenses that are out there to review them, and they do it publicly or have some type of quasi judicial process so that we know that the expenses that have occurred or the costs that have occurred, maybe not the expense, that they get resolved and we're not back here 3 years from now finding out that something else was punted. So you have the past problems, you have, you know, with the past problems, there's probably an indication we have current problems and then preventing future problems. So in acting a way to resolve problems, is there something that should be done that it's not a legislative branch, it's not an executive branch, but we try to bring in somebody who's truly independent, sort out the costs and pay them, because the independent, the third party assessment hasn't worked that was structured in there. The executive paying board or whatever isn't working. And these are not small numbers. These are real numbers. Is there some other way that could maybe be used, you know, it's almost like receivership or something like that, where you're having someone else that can be trusted that comes in and sorts this out. I know that's a lot, but I mean, it's been a lot. We've heard a lot. So how do you, and this is, you know, I know that Commissioner Zelli and the staff are here. It's a question to them too, when they come up. How do you sort yourself out of this?
I'll start, but I think, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll start, but Ms. Randall may also have thoughts as well. The question was asked earlier about, you know, what responsibility that the council has. And I think that there are problems in state government. There's lots of problems in state government. We know that because we're in the legislative auditor's office and you ask us to look at them. But we also are aware that there are problems in state government that get resolved because you have a commissioner or you have another senior official at an agency who says this is a problem and we're going to fix it, and they get resolved before they get to us. If we're having a hearing here, then you know, that means that somehow it didn't happen within the agency, and so that the fact that we got to this point is a reflection to some extent on the Met Council not having solved those problems internally. But one approach certainly could be for the Metropolitan Council itself to take a more active role in oversight and perhaps you know, revive its audit committee and do some things that are outside of the staff kind of pyramid of things to determine what has happened and to search for resolutions to make things different. Judy, you want to take?
Ms. Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. I think there are several questions here. So one is how to resolve the current situation. And then I think another question is how do we set things up so we don't get in this position again? So first to the current problems and the unresolved issues. The council in that settlement agreement did embed new processes for resolving these, you know, the alternative dispute resolution, mediation, binding arbitration. You know, it's not quite your judicial master, your special master process, but it's like that. And I think there's reason to believe that will at least get everybody to a settlement. Is it going to cost the state more? I don't know. I mean, I think we all have thoughts on that, but you know, we don't know. I also would note that the Met Council has made some changes recently in its structure, and I'm sure that they'll get up here and talk about that. But they have, I believe, done some reorganization to have more insight, I would say, into these large construction projects. But I'll let them speak to the effect of that. I think going forward, this really gets back to, frankly, the previous report, which is who is responsible for these projects and who is paying for these projects. And if they're not the same people, why not? And let's think about that as a state. The Met Council and frankly, from the state legislature, there's not a lot of direct funding in this project. It's county and federally funded largely. But the Met Council is the one who's the responsible authority making decisions. Should it have been Hennepin County being the responsible authority? That's a model that's out there that's worth considering. The council and the state have other light rail transit projects, coming up that are being discussed, that are being vetted. Now is the time to think hard about who should be the responsible authority for those projects. Based on what we've seen and based on kind of the structure we have for funding and building, I'm not convinced that Met Council is the right entity to be the responsible authority for those projects. I think now is the time before we enter into further contracts regarding transit. When we do enter into those new contracts, though, let's make sure we have alternative dispute resolutions. Let's make sure we have enforcement mechanisms that whoever the responsible authority is willing to use. And let's use those tools. So we've learned a lot over the past, decades on this project, but also over the last several reports that our office has issued. And I think that, shame on us if as a state, we don't do things differently going forward.
Senator Dibble, one final question.
Thanks. I took the opportunity to preview what I think we're going to hear from the Met Council by reading through the cover letter from the chair, as well as the technical response to the final report. The short version is the Met Council has done everything perfectly, and the auditor's report is completely deeply flawed and totally in error. And there's nothing correct in the findings of the report. Nothing to see here. Met Council is perfect. Do you ever respond to, or would you like to take the opportunity to respond to the response of the Met Council?
Ms. Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Senator Dibble. I would say we think it's important to give the agencies the opportunity to speak. So I'm glad we are going to be hearing from them. And I think it's important to have their letter in the back. As a true auditor and legislative auditor, I will probably stand by our findings and recommendations. Are we experts in transit construction? No. Are we engineers? No. We don't claim to be, we don't play one on TV, right? But what we are experts on is protecting the taxpayers' dollars, government process, appropriate procurement, documentation, ensuring that the state's money is used appropriately. And based on that, we find a lot of concerns. So I understand that the council thinks it doesn't align with FTA guidance. But what we are looking at is, are they following the state's expectations on how to manage these projects? And I think on that, I think our voice is appropriate.
I want to make sure I'm bipartisan here. So Senator Coran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Randall, along the line, Senator Dibble was asking, right, the overall scope. And I know from early conversations, not only the Met Council, but a variety of entities were somewhat challenging in order for you to do your work. In this particular project, there's been a couple reports, and we still have a financial one, but I do recall conversations regarding the withholding or information they deemed proprietary, private, whatever it is that they believed you didn't have access to or shouldn't have access to. And it gets to the overall question about, had they been cooperative in providing all of the information as any one of our agencies should be? In fact, they should be overtly cooperative with you to ensure or to make sure transparency, which is the foundation for trust, is preserved. And so were they cooperative? And if not, I know it puts you on the spot, Ms. Randall, but if they're not cooperative, was the information difficult, more difficult, or impossible to get? And just give me, just a high level overview. Were they cooperative? Because I believe in the original start of this process, they were less than cooperative. And certainly by their response, they don't agree with anything you've done. And not having a cooperative partner makes it more difficult for you to do the vital work you do. So,
Ms. Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Senator Coran. Well, as we have said in previous hearings, they were less than cooperative. That is in part why we have two reports on this topic, because it took too long to get information we requested. And so we divided it up into two so we could report out at least on what we could. There were some things we did not get. There were some things that we learned later. They had cut our access off too. When we realized that, they did make those corrections, but it was a difficult and challenging project for a lot of reasons. And I think, as we've discussed in this hearing, those 6,000 emails are kind of an example of how things went. We didn't start off by asking for 6,000 emails, right? We asked for, access to the system of record, which is called eBuilder, to get the documents that would support their actions. It was a difficult system to work through, and so we had a learning curve. But we kept getting pointed back to that system and saying, it's in there, and we couldn't find it. And so they thought we didn't know how to look at the system. So they gave us a specialist, basically, somebody to help guide us through that system, which was great. And that person did help us find some more things, but still there wasn't information in there that we expected to have in there. And that's what then led us to a broader request and say, okay, we need anything then related to this. And then that led us to the 6,000 emails, which takes time to get through. So it's a snowball effect. It was a challenge. I think we worked through most of it. But there were a lot of conversations.
Thank you, Chair, members of the committee. My name is Charlie Zelli. I'm Chair of the Metropolitan Council, and I'm joined by Nick Thompson, who's the Deputy General Manager for Capital Projects. And it's my honor to appear before you. I'll certainly be willing to answer questions, but I have kind of an opening comments. I see Senator Dibble's left the room, but I would just like to open by saying that I wish Met Council was perfect. Sadly, we are not. We are learning every day, and we certainly have learned a lot through the course of this project and the course of the reviews by the legislative auditor. We actually appreciate the feedback and from others as well. And I believe that we are making improvements, not just on the ongoing project management, but some of the larger kind of structural issues that have been described here. Just the need for additional improvements in documentation. We do have confidence in much of our documentation that we'll be able to deploy later in additional settlements with the contractors. But some of the larger initiatives that have been taken over the past 6 months is adopting a transit advancement policy. This is before we engage or start any new phase of any large transitway project, that we will have a full assessment of risks, full assessment of what we're entering. There's clear evidence that in these large mega projects, thinking slowly and methodically and understanding where responsibilities are, where financial risks are laid in is much better early on. And that it allows for smoother deployment later. And so we have a matter of policy and a practice that we've refined about entering transitway projects. I think Ms. Farmer referred to a new organizational structure. We are developing a new division as part of Met Transit. Met Transit is operations, but then there's Met Transit infrastructure project management. This isn't just one project. We have multiple projects, including Arterial Bus Rapid Transit. And, although all of those others that we've done in the past have worked well, we know that understanding our contracts, understanding what resources are required to support project teams and actually sharing best practice, particularly when it comes to developing appropriate contracts and is essential. And I think actually organizationally having a division that is really project management based, working with our funding partners is really clearly important. The other is just other best practices that we've incorporated in projects already. The gold line under construction, and now as we moving forward with others like the blue line, there's a number of practices that we've already put into place. There's been a lot of conversation about the independent cost estimators. It's in fact an issue that we've really wrestled with. There is advantages of having your design engineer be the independent cost estimator because they're so familiar with the engineering and the design of the project. But there's clearly a conflict, and we have found, and with the advice of MnDOT in their peer review, that an independent cost estimator is better that they are independent from the engineer of record and certainly independent from the contractor. They should not be independent from the owner. They're our advisor. And as we've discussed here, they should be actually very close and they should be trusted. We did have issues with the ICE in the past, working really closely with them to improve, and they did. Such things as what was cited by the legislative auditor about co-location with freight rail. That actually does matter and affects the cost. Site, field conditions matters. Sometimes it was so simple as scope, like how many of a certain unit. This is arithmetic. We had issues that we worked through. Now we have another independent cost estimator, and we find this process to be much better, and I think continuing to meet improvements. With that, I want to just take a quick pause and thank the legislature for the results of the past legislative session. Frankly, having funding to anticipate that we will be able to fund future projects and more importantly, our future operations for our robust transit network is really critical. So I appreciate very much that we have sustainable funding, but more importantly, that we are now having greater clarity about the roles and responsibilities that Met Council has and what would really inure to our funding partners, primarily counties. There's no question that the Met Council sponsors and is the portal for federal funding, but we will cover all future operations and long-term capital maintenance. We appreciate that the existing county sales tax receipts are then freed up to be the primary responsibility of this, of the capital costs, the local capital for transitway projects. And getting to some of our additional kind of learnings, as we are moving forward with the Blue Line, we're developing a project decision board, which really supplants this ECCB, a much more engaged multi-agency group where Hennepin County, in this case for the Blue Line, will have primary voting responsibility as they did with the ECCB, but that their staff and that their oversight and that their fiduciary kind of role along with us is fully shared, fully understood, and then gets closer to the model that's been recommended, that funding follows accountability for these projects. Now, as previously stated by me in a number of these occasions, it's really important to kind of start with the fact that the delays and the cost overruns of this project stem from the unseen and unknown, although thoroughly warned, conditions of the Kenilworth corridor. There's no question that the soil conditions, the time it takes to construct, the ways to construct, the adjacency and the foundation kind of proximity and disruption along Sika has really been the primary reason why there's this additional time and of course the additional cost. Much of that is what we're experiencing today. Of course, the corridor protection wall additional stations add to it, but I'm just kind of talking about this actual project is costing more because it always was going to cost more. It was under budgeted. It was had a suppressed funding budget, and it simply is not a $2 billion project. It is much closer to what we are projecting now, and we continue to face the risks of this Kenilworth corridor. There's just no question. And Met Council and the project partners, Hennepin County, and when it goes back to when this corridor was purchased in 1984. There's a long history which won't kind of relitigate. But once that path started, I am the first to admit that was an error in process, error in budgeting, and error in oversight. Given that, the project team has managed the complexity of what the project has become with its many changes using, I believe, our best practices and frankly, some very experienced and competent consultants to deliver the project. Project managed challenges posed by the proximity, as we described, of the Sika wall with a special engineering solution. We addressed the tunnel's unforeseen conditions through this settlement agreement. Settlement agreement we've talked a lot about, but it is essential because it provided for resequencing the work and a rebaseline of the schedule that allows two things. One, the project to keep going, and two, to actually mitigate the costs and the delays that would have happened had we not actually gone kind of outside the contract and renegotiate the contract to the betterment of the project and the betterment of costs. We actually have outside consultant opinions, but that is in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and actually at least 2 years. Even though there was a delay, it would have been much worse. The settlement agreement also added the alternative dispute resolution process, as you've just heard, but it did something else which wasn't mentioned as much. It capped our liability and provided greater accountability on the schedule. So yes, it was important to have that in a contract. We now have those elements. As change orders occur, I'm actually, and as a appointed fiduciary, I have gone deeply into understanding the level of expertise we have in evaluating change orders and a robust process for evaluating those change orders. I rely on the MnDOT peer review that evaluated the experts, the expertise, and the process of looking at each change order. So we're not paying for anything that we shouldn't be paying for. And MnDOT says that is an efficient, effective, and an appropriate process to evaluate change orders. No, it doesn't follow. And absolutely, we always are looking for ways to improve our documentation. But there is a document for each change order. And I think there was clearly miscommunications for having broad requests for information and allowing 6,000 emails. I can't defend that. That isn't appropriate. But in terms of managing the project, we have a far more focused and a far more robust process to ensure that we're doing it the right way. So in every respect, and through this process, has been reviewed, audited, and great oversight by the Federal Transportation Administration. And in my own fiduciary role, I've actually talked to senior staff, to the deputy administrators, to the regional administrators, and the administrator herself from FTA asking, are we doing the right job? Do we have a competent project team? Are we dropping the ball? Is there anything that I should know as an appointed official that we should be careful about? And they said, you have some of the best project teams that we've seen around the country. Sadly, your cost overruns and some of the issues that are associated with these mega projects are far more common over the past few years. And we've seen it in a number of different locations. Sadly, we're not alone. And there are some that have actually stopped projects, which becomes incredibly expensive, both in Baltimore and now in Hawaii. These are great kind of examples of projects which cost billions of dollars more not just hundreds of millions. And so we know that some of the work we're doing, and I won't go into depth on the non-conforming work, but Curry Building is a good example. That is an actual case that is under investigation, and the work around that area continues to this day. We have not kept any, nor have we agreed to pay any additional amounts to the contractor. That is something that needs to be resolved. But as they say, it's hard to fix the plane while you're flying it. There's a lot of things going on as we are building this project. The worst thing we could do is to delay this project anymore, to keep it on track and to keep our minds and fiduciary roles and our project management practice focused on delivering it in a cost-effective way. So I could go on, and I'm really open to along with Nick to answer your questions. I will conclude by acknowledging that, again, we have learned a lot. We are open and interested and listen to the legislative auditors' advice, recommendations, as well as those from MnDOT, those from we learned from our many outside national experts. But I have to say, I'm pleased that the project is progressing. We've worked through some very difficult situations, I believe, in ways that have mitigated costs for taxpayers. As an appointee of the governor, who has talked to me on a number of occasions about this project, are we doing everything we can do to deliver it efficiently, at the least expense, and as quickly as possible? And I have to assure you from, I have seen, and I've gone into deep detail, along with Council Member Barber, who is chair of the Transportation Committee, the other members of the ECCB. We've gotten in, not just with my steel-toed boots walking in the tunnel, but actual meetings and going through each kind of action. I should say, when an action comes before the ECCB, there's a lot of conversation and direct analysis that we go through with staff prior to a meeting, which isn't always seen, but should be understood to be there. So I expect that we will have the best outcome for the taxpayers, although this project is more expensive on a per mile basis. It is competitive, and given the $2 billion of development that's already taking place, has already provided value for our region, and we expect to have more so in the future. So thank you very much.
So we got several questions. Senator Dibble and then Representative Quam.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Chair Zelli, couple of questions quickly. I'll have more later, but you know, to hear you, to read your letter and to hear you testify here, you know, you say things like we're not perfect and we're learning things and we're putting new things in place, et cetera. None of that is reflected in the official response. The official response is not really a response, it's a rebuttal, the point-by-point rebuttal of every point that the legislative auditor raises. So I'll just ask the general question because I have some specific questions, but maybe I'll just give you the opportunity. Is there anything in the legislative auditor's report that you find credible, that is a critique and a criticism that the Met Council can view as helpful, to take to heart, provide guidance, to provide some indication of ways in which the Met Council can change its practices, its ability to take in criticism, critique, oversight, and operationalize those observations from external to the organization?
Chair Zelli.
Mr. Chair, Senator Dibble, absolutely. And I think that some of the recommendations about having some of the elements that we've now negotiated into this contract to be in the contract at the very beginning. I've heard that loud and clear. Having a much better and more robust simplified documentation. We need to continue to improve how we document, how that's organized. And that's certainly taken to heart. I think the areas of cost estimating is something they've pointed out and we've learned from, and we acknowledge that we have worked and now we are following a different practice that we had initially, and part of that is due to the legislative auditors recommendations and observations. I think the process of the fact that funding should follow accountability, that's been made a number of times. We actually think that makes a lot of sense. We're kind of for whatever reason, in a bizarre structure where we're held financially accountable without the resources to back that up. And I think that the idea of project governance itself, which we're responding with this project-based kind of sharing entity, that comes in part from the OLA's observations and recommendations. I've said, and maybe you're out of the room, that we're far from perfect, but we also take a lot of these recommendations to heart. I think when it comes to the actual review and analysis that we've had with experts on change orders, I just think it's important to point out that from what we've seen and from the work that we've done with our consultants and our kind of robust process, that you should know that we're not paying for something that didn't happen. We're not paying for a DBE when a DBE wasn't there. And so I just want to assure you that some of this has taken the scrutiny of all the policymakers and others when they've been observed, to second guess, to make sure that we are following what we know can be the best practice in the construction of large mega projects, which are a special animal by itself. And I also would suggest that some of the processes that we've learned to improve have worked well in the Central Corridor, worked well in some of the other projects we've had, but they didn't work well here. And I think it goes back to the initial scoping and some of the points that you've made that should never have been in that corridor with this kind of process. So we've learned from the OLA, we're very open to those observations, but we've also learned from the project itself and from other outsiders.
So just to give a little timeline here, so I'll go to Senator Dibble, and then we have Representative Quam, Representative Hornstein, Senator Coran, and Representative Jacob, and I would like to adjourn at about 11:30. So Senator Dibble.
Thanks. Well, I appreciate those comments. I'll just point out for the record, Mr. Chair, none of that is reflected in the response. The response is a point by point rebuttal, goes into great detail, and doesn't just rebut the points, every point that the legislative auditor raises, impugns the ability and the of the OLA itself to even be a credible entity, credible professionals to even provide the kind of analysis. And so I don't take a lot of confidence from the official on the record response that the Metropolitan Council provides to provide the proper documentation for this report. It's very unusual. Most executive branch agencies, which the Met Council kind of is, it's also kind of a local unit of government separate and apart from state government. Even when they feel stung by the findings of the legislative auditor, absorb the findings and can provide an effective and effectual response and indicate how they will examine and analyze and make changes in response to the finding of the legislative auditor. This is a rebuttal in total, in sum, and I think it speaks to the culture of the agency, which is whenever a criticism or a suggestion or different information is provided, the posture is defensive and hostile, whether that come from Met Council members themselves. I have many reports from Met Council members who question the staff reports that come forward and are told that they can't actually change the direction of the staff report. Every single time Representative Hornstein and I have ever provided suggestions to the Met Council, it's been responded to with a defensive posture and or complete and total disinformation, citing FTA regulations and FTA rules where we find out immediately are untrue. So I would just advise the Met Council, you as the chair, the Met Council members, I'm not going to speak to the staff because they report to the commission, they report to you, and by extension to the governor and to ourselves as elected officials, to be more open to the kinds of things that people are concerned about, particularly those people who are representing with election certificates the public's interest. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator Bull, I have heard your feedback. And we will certainly take that to heart. I do think that it's important to the extent that we listen and are open to feedback, and we should be. And to the extent that our official response doesn't reflect that, it should. I do think, and I appreciate that the legislative auditor said that they are not construction or mega project experts, but we have construction and mega project experts who have given a different point of view. And so to the extent it sounds like a rebuttal, it is simply presenting the situation as we see it.
Representative Quam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And wow, not overpaying and best teams. Why are we even here if any of that was true? The numbers and the data don't support that. This is not the first light rail project that your entity has been involved with. When I've done private sector project program management, we finish it, project, we do a postmortem and we figure out how we can do things better. And if all the other ones ran great and this one has so many issues, there obviously is some incongruity there. And the statement that you knew from the beginning that was going to take longer and cost considerably more, how we as a legislature can justify including any of your estimates and projects and taking you at your word is just shocking. Very, very shocking. And the audit response in the real world, I've been on the receiving and the giving end of audits. If you're asked to show documentation and procedures and policies, etc., and you can't, you fail. If you don't follow the procedures you say that you have, you fail. But real world and pixie dust. Well, I should go on and say there are the problems and issues that have been discovered and highlighted in this and previous audits. Are those being caused by bad procedures or incompetent personnel or a combination of both? That would be a question.
Chair Zelia.
Mr. Chair, Representative, when I stated that these costs were inevitable at the beginning of the project, I didn't say we knew. We should have known. We didn't, and we should. And we've changed a lot of our risk analysis, our transit advancement policy, the process for estimating in a very complex project, which and also the fact that this is occurring in other projects around the country speaks to the nature of these mega projects. We are not perfect. Can we improve our competency and procedures? Absolutely. I do not believe it is an issue of people being inept, nor corruption. The project should have been budgeted at the level more of what we recognize it is now. It should have been, because that's what it's going to cost. And it would have been better for us early on when this alignment or how the processes of maybe whether a tunnel should not have been built or some of those questions clearly were set in motion years ago. And we're not saying I'm saying that that's a flaw, and it should have been recognized. But I think given those set of circumstances, that the project team, not perfect, but have done a much more competent job than I think this body might be thinking, given the set of circumstances it faced.
Representative Quam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And because we've heard and been informed that federal dollars were utilized in this project. And frankly, with those, there are federally required oversight and documentation requirements. And looking at the audit, I don't see how those were achieved by their guidelines. So you'll find that if there is a federal look, they won't be as nice and cordial as the legislative auditor. They actually think people need to be competent and do what they say or plan to do. Frankly, the portions of our population that require and depend upon transit deserve to have the projects and the activity around transit to be competent, to be thought out well, so that there's a confidence that's lacking if you have all these issues when you're building it. Is it going to be safe a couple of years down the line? Are there going to be other problems? There are trust issues that are popping up from different groups, whether they're the people in the community, in the neighborhood, that discover that their building might fall down. If you look at Austin and other locations in Rochester where they've had apartment complexes that have structurally failed and people have been killed, and that you don't have to go back more than a few weeks to see examples of that. If I was living along that route and hearing and seeing, I would be concerned. And what I've heard and seen from the Met Council in the reaction to an audit shows a lack of reality and the possibilities and the capabilities that we're needing. But we don't have 3, 4, 5 hours to go over the details. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Well,
Chair Zelle.
Mr. Chair, Representative, I not only do I have oversight as chair of the Met Council, I live alongside that corridor. I spend many hours with the Sika residents, with that building, and with the engineers and the project team addressing the very issues that you would be concerned about. I can say with confidence that that building will be left in better shape than before this project ever started. And there is a very good process of communication with that resident association. I'm staying very close to them myself, as is the project team, weekly meetings with their engineers. It is incredibly close. It was incredibly disruptive. It's a very difficult situation, but I feel confident that we're doing everything we can. So that kind of examples that's happening in other parts of the country is not going to happen here in Minneapolis. And I can attest to the mood of every resident because they're my friends. I know them, they're my neighbors. They're mostly concerned now with some of the freight traffic that's coming through, with some of the safety issues associated with the operations. They understand that it's going to take longer. Once it's done, there's going to be bike paths that'll be better. But devil's in the details. I hear you, but those are ones where I feel that the importance of appreciating what's done well, being open to change and come with some humility that this is difficult, but that the project team that's there now is doing the job under heavy oversight and scrutiny by the FTA, who have told me and others that they're doing a good job given the set of circumstances they're facing. So that gives me more confidence.
So
See you in a few years.
we have Representative Hornstein, Senator Cran, and then Representative Jacob. So Representative Hornstein.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I have a question related to the letter that you responded to along similar lines that Chair Dibble mentioned, but I just wanted to preface that my question with, one example of, our constituents, the people that Chair Dibble and I, represent, have been talking about this for over 10 years, warning about it, meeting after meeting after meeting. some of the issues we're talking about. And a case study of this, one I remember very clearly at the Kenwood Rec Center, I think it was 9 or 10 years ago. Senator Dibble and I had asked that time Governor Dayton to, slow down this process, stop it so we could get a second opinion on whether this tunnel was necessary and whether we could move the freight. We got the second opinion from a consultant who was hired called Trans Systems, and Trans Systems said, yes, it is possible to do this project. And I don't want to relitigate all of that, but they did say it is possible to do this project without tunneling, having the freight in St. Louis Park. And so I think that's just an example of one of many where, I think Chair Dibble had mentioned that suggestions were made not just by constituents and elected officials, but even trusted consultants. But along those lines, in the second paragraph, you state that while we appreciate the OLA's attention to this matter, and this is related to the contracts, several reports recommendations don't align with FTA guidance, are not appropriate for a project this size. And this is the phrase that I'm concerned about that I'd like you to respond to. Again, relates to the point I made and Chair Dibble made earlier. And in some instances could have contributed to additional delay. What does that mean exactly? Am I reading this correctly, that additional public scrutiny causes delay? What did you mean by that phrase? In some instances could have contributed to additional delay. Is it relate to the contracting issues? I would like you to maybe examine that further. I don't know. I think the way it's written is a bit confusing. In the second paragraph of your letter.
Mr. Chair and Representative Bernstein, I can't say that this is the language is as clear as it needed to be. It's not the question of public scrutiny being the cause of delay, but I defer to on this particular point to Nick Thompson.
Mr. Chair, Representative Hornstein, this I think was referring to the recommendation to not proceed with a change order until you have a total complete understanding of the schedule. And in particular around the work we did in the tunnel, we anticipated that if we did follow that recommendation, we would have added 374 days of delay, I think we said in our response, to start work. And so there's some steps where you want to continue the work to occur before you fully understand the schedule impact. And maybe we didn't word that correctly, as clear as possible, but that was referencing about, do you wait to do the work, or do you keep going, have the work continue to go forward while you're negotiating either the price or the price plus the schedule? And that's referencing the part 1, part 2 change order system, which I believe is described in the report about how that works. So.
Mr. Thompson, if you just state your name
Yep.
for the record.
Nick Thompson, Deputy General Manager, Capital Programs for Metro Transit.
Representative Hornstein.
Well, thank you for that clarification, because I think there have been instances in the past where again, public processes have been, decisions have been made. I think I think there was reference to this earlier. Decisions are made, then there's a public hearing. And I think that is a concern that many of us have had over many years, and not just with the Met Council. A number of entities, public entities, decisions are made, then there's ostensibly a public process. And I hope that as we move forward, we can correct that situation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Zelli, I was jotting down your amazing statements on how great everything is. Your corrective action plan, which you recently discovered in this project, the first of many large projects you've already incurred. You said that what you should have known it was going to cost, instead of 1.3 billion, we certainly are going to be at $3 billion by the time this is done in the time frame. There were hundreds of people in the Met Council under your jurisdiction and before you as well, so not everything is on you. The sole responsibility for every aspect of this project. We're talking, I think Senator Dibble and Representative Hornstein talked about the 10 years prior to engaging in construction. Yet it's more like 20 years overall. And then you talk about a self-assessment. Discount, right? You described what all you're going to do, right? All of the new changes. Not one recommendation was acknowledged of the legislative audit findings. But you laid them out, which are basically your core responsibilities in every aspect of your job of running the agency and the public transit system. I'm just somewhat amazed at, we should have known it. We knew it was going to cost more. Well, do we assume that for everything? This one took 20 years of planning. And one of your statements was, well, don't worry, we now have a new 6-month transit advancement project, and that's going to solve all the problems. You described, we were learning more every day. Well, thank you. That's what you're supposed to do. You have confidence in the documentation. I think the audit report indicates that's not true, or we don't believe so. And your lack of contrition, your lack of compliance with the legislative auditor, you should have been begging them and providing and guiding them. And then you even said I think you said, when Senator Dibble said, well, your rebuttal to every single issue doesn't reflect that. You said, well, I'm sorry. Did you read it before you signed it? I'm not sure. I mean, I'm really not sure, because your description of what is our corrective action and how we're going to believe and have trust moving forward is going to be very, very difficult. And then another statement you made was funding should follow accountability. It's extraordinary. What does that mean? There's been no accountability in this entire process. The decisions about a tunnel, no tunnel, whatever those were decisions that have consequences. They weren't made by this body. They were made by the people who spent 20 years in deciding the path and the opportunities and what are the risks. Those should all have been known and well-informed. And we should have been the most informed, and we weren't. Senator Dibble and Representative Hornstein sure as heck have been involved since day one on this thing at a detailed manner. And so I just find it extraordinarily difficult that your best practices and those things that we're going to move forward on, that we're supposed to believe in what you just said. It was an extraordinary self-congratulations about the great work you've done. And again, I know you've got great people working as well, but this is a 20-year project. We're now $3 billion. And we just laid out a whole network of public transportation expenditures. And we're supposed to trust your organization to deliver better and to be accountable when we've seen nothing in this project. And from the beginning of the awareness of what's the significant cost, there really has been very little change. And so to me, that's what I'm most upset about. And so I guess just for the heck of it, just so the public understands, right? I don't think anybody understands what $3 billion means, but why don't you just give us a little bit of how many hundreds of FTEs worked on this project prior to the construction decision, and how many since the post-construction, right? When you decided to go into the procurement and that process. Give people a little bit of scope of the number and size, not those of the contractor, what those FTEs are, but Met Council, you started 20 plus years ago. How many hundreds of positions were there? Just give people a little bit of scope. We talk as if, well, some of these things were just unknown. You had 20 years. And if you can't have a proper assessment and proper decision-making, even though I think you said the FTA said, we did a great job, we followed everything. You can follow everything to the letter of the law or the policies and rules and still be very wrong or very uninformed in making those decisions that have extraordinary consequences. And so why don't you just give the people, I'll leave it with that, just give the people a little snapshot of the hundreds and hundreds of employees that worked on this prior to even the beginning of the construction and then post-construction just on Southwest Light Rail. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Chair Zelli.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator, to clarify, this project began construction at a $2 billion cost figure, and it has clearly increased for the reasons I've cited. and I come with great humility, not self-congratulations, but to simply report not the flawlessness of the project, but the competence of the team that is working through difficult issues, particularly over the past, which is what I'm reporting on, the work, the actions we've taken over the past 2 years and some even more recently. In terms of the number of people who worked on this project, it is hundreds. Nick is failing me here. Any idea how many?
Mr. Thompson.
I can, Mr. Chair, Senator, I can talk about how many are currently working on it, but since the project that started in 1984, the number of different individuals and different entities, I wouldn't want to guess at that number.
We can certainly gather that information and report back to you. It has been a long period of time, and I would also say the other projects that have been delivered by Met Council have much better track record in terms of budget and timing. But there were actually more change orders on the Central Corridor than there are on this project. That came on time, on budget. But this is a particularly big, complex. The tunnel is clearly the biggest issue, but it also has flyovers, wetlands, other tunnels, co-location with freight rail. It has almost every kind of element that can cause risk to a project. And we are far from flawless. We did not anticipate, and we should have early in the phases of this plan.
Mr. Chair,
Senator Grant.
just a quick, that you've been the sole governing body of this project over 20 years. It's not the first time you've had the assessment of that looking back to 98. It's unfortunate you can't answer the basic question to provide that information after the fact. You're here at a hearing today to talk about this process, and that information should have been. You did say you could give us the number of those that are working on it today. Please give us at least, since the construction decision was made, the closest time for your period in which you are managing the process. How many hundreds of people are there?
Mr. Thompson.
Mr. Chair, Senator, so in terms of the project oversight, which is essentially the organizational chart for it, there's over 60 employees that are both consultants that are in the project office, Met Council employees, Hennepin County employees, MnDOT employees. That's essentially the team, the project office team. Then we have, of course, the contractor and the engineer of record. They have their own teams. Contractor, I believe, laborers have over, I think the last number was over 7,000 different labor in the workforce have been in the construction phase of this project that have taken home a paycheck related to the project. So the project oversight is the smaller number of that. The laborers and construction contractors are quite a large number.
So I want to make sure we get Representative Jacob in, and then I'm going to go to Hornstein and Dibble. So Representative Jacob.
Thank you. Thank you to the auditor here for the work on this, what we're dealing with here today. So just as a new legislator, a couple of just really basic, straightforward questions for Mr. Zelli here, so I can go back to my district with clear answers. Give me the original projected price, the original projected completion date, and the current projected price and the current projected completion date. Probably everyone else who's been here 20 years already knows that.
Chair Zelli.
Mr. Chair, Representative Jacob, the original completion date with the start of construction was 2023 this year. And the budget was approximately $2 billion. 2 years ago, we had a new forecast that's 2.75 billion roughly, and the completion date was 2027.
Representative Jacob.
Is the 2.75, is that still an accurate number? Are you going to be asking for more time and more money? Where are you at?
Chair Zelli.
Mr. Chair, Representative, we are still in the riskiest area of construction. completing the Kenilworth Tunnel. So I think that there is possibilities of additional costs, and also considering the proximity and the complications along Sika. But we have no evidence now to know what that would be. I think over the next 2 years, we'll get through this most riskiest and part of the project.
Representative Jacob.
So the answer that you just gave you're saying you don't know for sure about the time, but you're saying that the 2.75 billion is not going to cover it. Do you have a number you can give me? A projected cost?
Mr. Thompson.
Mr. Thompson, you can answer.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Representative, great question. So we have not changed from that number yet on that budget. We now enter a process with FTA to update the project budget by the end of January of next year, or so this upcoming January. So that will be the next time if there is a change in the budget, which we are not forecasting yet. If there will be, that would be the next update to the budget. And the 2027 opening date is still the date that we have. But again, as the chair mentioned, we're in the riskiest part of the project. We remain. Project itself is 75% complete. And prior to that new budget revision and update in January, we'll have accomplished 6 more months of work and gotten through a lot more of the risk. And so our next chance, we'll look at that number, and the opening date would be January of 2024.
Representative Jacob, last question.
Sure. And maybe just a bit more of a statement, and I'll let you move on. But so you had stated that, Mr. Zelli, that the 2 billion was an entirely unbudgeted or under budgeted number to begin with. And it's just really hard to build trust within the community when if you felt as though that was an under budgeted number to begin with, the community should have had a better grip on what the project was actually going to cost. And that certainly might have had an impact on whether the project would have went forward at all. So to under budget to begin with in order to get the community to come on board and support the project, and then say that number was under budgeted, it just doesn't bode well for us as a government. I mean, we want complete transparency. We want the community to know exactly what we're doing. So it just doesn't feel good to bring forward numbers that probably aren't actual and factual to begin with. So more of a statement here at the end, but thank you.
Mr. Chair, Representative, just to be clear, in hindsight, it is my opinion that was under budgeted. It should have been more. At the time, our engineer of record and all the design engineers of the project gave that number as a solid number. It in retrospect, in hindsight's everything, it was inadequate. That is only in hindsight years later.
Senator Dibble, close.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just note for the record that this issue of escalating costs goes back to prior to 2010, and it has a lot to do with what Chair Zelli said, that it was going to be the Kenilworth corridor come hell or high water starting back in 1984, and the agency, in conversation with Hennepin County, they're partially responsible as well, was not going to be dissuaded by any expense and any evidence, anything coming external to the agency that might have caused it to step back and take a fresh look. And looking at, going back to 2010, 1.25 billion, 2011, it goes up to almost 4, 2013, 1.5, and on it goes, literally every few months, escalating by a few $100 million. And now we're at 2.7, and we're probably going to top out at over 3 billion. All, kind of matters that no one could have known about. And, anyways, so I made my point. I wanted to just kind of conclude by bringing an episode from recent history as an object lesson. And what I'm going to talk about is going to be somewhat bewildering to the Met Council because they're going to think, oh, we were highly responsive to the community and the issues it raised, but it never should have gotten to this point, is the point that I'm making. And that has to do with this issue of dealing with all of the people that were converging on downtown last weekend for the Taylor Swift concert and for the Pride festivities. Tens of thousands of people. And the initial response from the Met Council was, we have a deficiency of operators. We conclude our service, sometime, around midnight, 11:30 midnight. We are just simply not going to be able to transport people out of downtown after the concert lets out. Then Representative Hornstein and I, the mayor, others said, we got to figure this out. This is not an acceptable response. And to the credit of the chair, they figured it out. Service was provided. It never should have been a news item. We didn't hear from a single Met Council member through this entire process. If in fact the Met Council, I'll just lay my card on the table. If the Met Council was governed by an entity that felt a high level of exposure and responsiveness to the public it served, this would have been a problem that would have been dealt with way upstream, and it would have been solved. And the fact that people were up in arms and in a state of panic, and heroic efforts need to be mounted to solve the problem, tells us that there's something about this agency that allows it to think it's okay to say in the public, you're on your own, tens of thousands of people. Something is wrong with a culture that allows for that. I said to the chair, and I bet you if the council member were elective, they would have said, I'll learn how to drive a train. You should learn how to drive. We're all going to learn how to drive trains. We're going to solve this problem. This is not going to be an issue. This is not going to end up in the newspapers. We're going to do our public duty. A lot of what we're talking about here, the misfeasance, the malfeasance, the nonfeasance that's woven throughout this document has to do with a culture in which there's a complete lack of sensitivity and responsiveness and attunement to the public responsibility and the public duties that it has. And I'll just leave it at that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Chair Zelli.
Mr. Chair, Senator Dibble, point well taken. It was inappropriate messaging to say that the Met Transit wouldn't be providing service because clearly we did, and I believe there was apprehension about our operator shortage. I'm proud of the service we provided, and we did have a number of extra operators, and it worked out. It should never have been given up to the point of panic, and that's a point well taken.
Representative Hornstein.
Thank you. I think the points were made, and I appreciate this hearing and you're including me, even though I'm not a member of the commission. So thank you so much, Mr. Chair.
Chair Zelli, we deal with a lot of laws here, but the one that's always there that we can't change is Murphy's. And we should prepare for it. And all along here, it seems like we ignore it. Somebody's ignored it. And then it's a surprise. So I think Senator Dibble and, you've had a bipartisan discussion here. Something's wrong. And we're dealing with billions of dollars and we're trusting you to do a lot more. So something's got to change somehow. Not just on this project, but we're relying on you to do a lot. So, I think having discussions with the legislators and, with the appointed council members and getting out into the community and picking up the tremors before they happen here is a good preventive mechanism. And I'd encourage you and the folks on the council and the staff to be doing that. But for right now, we have to find some way of assuring that this is going to work. This particular thing is going to work and not be perpetual machine that just keeps going on with more cost. It needs to get done, but it also needs to get done responsibly. And as I mentioned before, we can't manage by audit. You know, the auditor staff are here to work for the people, working for the elected legislators, you know, to be their voice and do what we can't do. But this has, you know, been one of several. And that's our responsibility, is to make sure that we're providing that transparency. So I'd encourage you to keep working with us on that. And we don't want to keep having to have these audits, but I think we will be, because it's big ticket items. And we just appropriated a lot of money to a lot of things, and we need to make sure that it's spent well for the people of Minnesota. So with that, maybe Ms. Randall, if you want to just give a foreshadowing of what else we have during the interim. Okay. Randall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Just real quickly, I'll talk about what's coming up from our office. Next week on July 5th, we'll be releasing a special review related to the Guardian Ad Litem Board's data access rules. It'll be just, it's about a 12-page little report. We'll release it on our website. I don't plan on having a hearing, but obviously if anyone has questions or wants to have a hearing, we'll be happy to do so. We're also working on 3 other special reviews. One is on the Hometown Heroes Assistance Program, which is a grant program operated by the Department of Public Safety. And we're hoping to have that special review out by the end of summer. We are also continuing our work looking at the Minnesota Department of Education's oversight of feeding our future. So digging deep into that, and I'm hoping that will be out in the fall. And then we are, of course, are also doing our law enforcement compensation report, which is mandated that we do that by the legislature. That will also be out in the fall. We have a number of financial audit reports or audits that are underway that we're hoping to release by September or in September. I'll just run through those real quickly so you get a sense of what's on tap. We have financial audits coming out of the Secretary of State, the Office of the Secretary of State, and also the Attorney General's office. That's part of our responsibility to audit those constitutional offices. We are conducting an audit on frontline worker pay. We're looking at the Minnesota Board on Aging, the senior nutrition program. So Meals on Wheels is what I always think of, you know, out to community members. We're looking at a series of retroactive pay adjustments that were made for members of the Minnesota Law Enforcement Association across several agencies. We are also conducting an audit. I feel like I'm just running down this list. The Minnesota Board of Firefighter Training and Education. And then, of course, I mentioned we're also still conducting a financial audit related to some of Met Council's financial transactions for the Southwest Project. And then we are conducting an IT audit of the unemployment insurance information system. And then I think you already know all the program evaluations we're working on that you all approved. So we are very busy. I do want to thank members. I felt a lot of support from the legislature this year, and I really appreciated Representative Hansen and Senator Curran and Senator Rest, who carried bills for us. And I'm happy to say that we were able to successfully get those language changes that we needed. And then we also received the budget that we requested, which is allowing us to hire some additional special review staff. Actually, we are onboarding 2 staff this week in the special review department. So I want to thank you for your support. For holding this hearing and let us know how we can continue to be of service. Thanks.
Thank you. We are adjourned.